All right, rejoining the channel is Moochie award-winning Brad Peniston. Brad is with Defense One, and Brad, we've had some goings on at the Pentagon, particularly with the Pentagon press corps in the last 24, 48 hours that are kind of remarkable. This administration has had kind of a running gun battle going with the press, and Secretary Hegseth particularly has had his issues with the Pentagon press corps since the beginning, and we'll review some of those highlights, lowlights as we go along here. But some kind of amazing, let's just say, images emerged yesterday. Here's our good friend Tara Kopp of the Washington Post cleaning out her desk there at the Pentagon. And then there's this mass walkout at the close of business yesterday. You can see I recognize Jeff Skogel of Task and Purpose, Courtney Kuby of NBC News. Who else we got there? Anybody else jump out at you?
Yeah, I got a couple of my reporters there as well from Defense One.
Okay. So everybody, it's like a mass layoff, the way it looks, with everybody with their boxes and taking all of their tchotchkes and everything away from their desk and walking out of the main entrance there. That's the VIP entrance, as it were, to the Pentagon. There's significant misunderstanding on either side of the political spectrum, as with everything these days. So walk us through what the reason for, let's just call it the walkout, was, and in the case of you guys at Defense One and dozens of other news organizations, why you guys chose not to sign the new policy for the conduct of the Pentagon press corps.
Right. Well, first of all, Ward, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk, and hopefully we'll leave your viewers with a better understanding of what's going on. So maybe we can start with the basics. When we say the Pentagon press corps, we are talking about 100 journalists who cover the Defense Department and the military services, generally out of the Pentagon, but not always. Many of them work for large news organizations, the broadcast news, the New York Times, the Washington Post, that sort of stuff. Many others work for smaller defense-oriented publications like mine. These are the ones who do the daily work of covering the Defense Department and the military services. They do it under a system that had been in place for decades. I've been doing this for more than 25 years now, and so I can describe what has been the case for a long time, and then what has changed already. So each of the members of the Pentagon press corps has a building access pass. This is something that you apply for when you're first signed to the beat. You fill out a form acknowledging that you know the rules and that you've got a security briefing. When I got mine, I got fingerprinted, and so eventually the Department of Defense says, "Okay, that's good. We recognize you as an accredited journalist, and so you can have this access pass." What that gets you is the ability to get into the world's largest office building, only to the unclassified spaces, the hallways, the food court. There's a public affairs space where a lot of the Pentagon spokespeople work, and where a bunch of the news organizations who are members of the press corps have their stuff. TV folks especially have a lot of gear, and they keep it there rather than having to bring it back and forth every single time they have to do a little bit of reporting. Everybody wears their badge, above the waist as regulations require. And again, you get no access to unclassified spaces. It's just not done. So that's the Pentagon press corps and kind of how it's been done. It started to change this year with the new administration. The first thing that happened in January was a lot of the organizations that had workspace in the public affairs area within the Pentagon got booted out, and mostly conservative outlets were brought in to replace them. In May, then, there were further restrictions placed on where you could go. Unclassified hallways and spaces were cut off to those holding a press pass. Then finally in September, on a Friday evening, the Office of the Secretary of Defense sent out a memo to news organizations, and it said, Here is a 21-page agreement to replace the one-pager that you all signed when you got your access passes that we need you to sign, or else we're going to revoke your access. And so that initial one, Defense One, like every other member of the Pentagon press corps, reviewed it, and it seemed to suggest that. Several things, just restrictions on gathering. It seemed to suggest that everything we wrote would have to be pre-approved by the Department of Defense before we could write it. And so, organizations went back. Some of the bigger ones talked to the Pentagon directly. There's also an association called the Pentagon Press Association, which is an organization of the individual journalists who have press passes. They went and talked to the Pentagon officials, and they said, this we can't sign. So a couple weeks went by, and the Office of Secretary of Defense put out a second memo in mid-October saying, or early October actually, saying, okay, well, we've updated this, and it does a couple of things. For one thing, it says specifically, we don't need pre-approval. So that was fine, but it left in place a lot of the new restrictions that reporters were being asked to sign to. And in particular, it also said that we would have to acknowledge that it could be considered a crime to ask for information, even unclassified information. And so, that plus other objections finally led just about every organization that covers the Pentagon to decline to sign the new agreement. And a lot of them have put out statements explaining their thinking and why they wouldn't sign the agreement. The deadline to sign the agreement was yesterday. And so consequently, that's where all the photos that you just showed came from. They're reporters packing up and leaving because they would not agree to the new strictures that the Pentagon leadership asked them to.
So let's bring up the specific language that we're talking about here. So you can see this attempts to thread a needle, as it were, that you just described is problematic for the journalists that cover the Pentagon. So DOW, Department of War, remains committed to transparency, ... We have to safeguard classified national security information. And as you said, the original thing you signed said, of course, you acknowledge that you're not going to go into any classified spaces, not going to release classified information to break news or whatever, in accordance with Executive Order 13526 and the Atomic Energy Act. And here's where it gets a little squishier. And information designated as controlled unclassified information, CUI, in accordance with another executive order, 13556. Only authorized persons who have received favorable determinations of eligibility for access, signed approved non-disclosure agreements, and have a need to know may be granted access to classified national security information. Roger that. No quarrel there. Department of War may only provide CUI to individuals when there is a lawful government purpose for doing so. Unauthorized disclosure of either of those things poses a security risk that could damage the national security of the United States and place Department of War personnel in jeopardy. They talk about this unclassified information that you could come into the possession of that is newsworthy. And basically what they're saying now, what they wanted your journalists and all the other organizations that are part of the Pentagon press corps with a physical presence in the Pentagon to say, in essence, we will run this by you before we go to print or before we hit post. Now it de facto makes the Pentagon an editor in the chop shop.
That is what the very first memo that they sent out in September said. In the October memo, they said explicitly that journalists do not have to run things by the Defense Department for approval. And yet, there's still room, not just in that passage you just quoted, but throughout the 21-page document, that news organizations found objectionable. So this is what David Schultz, who is the director of the Media Freedom and Information Access Clinic at Yale Law School, said. He says that the Pentagon is requiring reporters for the first time to affirm in writing that they understand that national security is harmed by disclosing information the Pentagon has not approved for release, even if that information is unclassified. Ann Schultz says, we know that's not true. So in the second version, the Pentagon did back off the explicit statement that we have to run everything by them, but still implicitly has it in other parts of the document.
In any case, this is something that all but one outlet has walked away from, including Fox News and Newsmax. So now what happens?
Now, we in the journalism community continue to do our jobs. We won't do it inside the Pentagon anymore, but we will continue to bring information to the public that we believe serves the public's interest. So you mentioned Fox News. Let me read to you just a little bit of the statement that they, along with a couple of the other broadcast networks, issued about this. They said, today we join virtually every other news organization in declining to agree to the Pentagon's new requirements, which, Fox and the rest of them say, would restrict journalists' ability to keep the nation and the world informed of important national security issues. The policy is without precedent and threatens core journalistic protections. My organization, Defense One, joined with 7 other defense-oriented publications to put out our own statement, and that one said, for decades, the defense trade media has been a trusted source of news and insight about Defense Department programs, budgets, and strategy. Ethical, accurate, and timely reporting makes that possible. And the public, industry, and indeed the department itself all benefit from granting credentialed defense reporters access to unclassified areas in the Pentagon and from the trust engendered by that access. So that's kind of a taste of how news organizations, as you say, all across the spectrum, have reacted to this.
You and I are both alums of military.com. Military.com was the first digital-only outlet to get a Pentagon press pass. That was our good friend Steve Trimble, who's on the channel from time to time, who now works at Aviation Week. It's just kind of a fun fact. But I've worn both hats, which I think brings a perspective to this particular issue that's unique, meaning I was in the Navy as a Tomcat Rio for 20 years. Then I was the spokesman for the V-22 program on the government side during some pretty chaotic years, 02 to 05, which is basically return to flight of that airplane that program had been shut down for a number of high-profile crashes and was almost canceled. But it was brought back to life. So I was the spokesman from 02 to 05 when it got its full rate production decision and passed op-eval. So it was no longer a controversial program. My phone stopped ringing. So I've dealt with all kinds of trade press primarily, but also national media. Jamie McIntyre at CNN and others were on this beat. So I've done it from that side. And then I took the job as the editor of military.com. So then, you and I became colleagues. And so I became the guy that was asking my previous self, what do you know about this thing that I already know about? Right. And so I know the difference between hack journalism and thorough professional journalism. I've been frustrated by journalists and have been able to affect change at particularly a newspaper when this journalist was caught dead to rights getting the story factually wrong because of his bias. So what I said after the Midnight Hammer kerfuffle, where Secretary Hegseth leaned into the Pentagon press corps stridently about how they're not covering the news and how they have this bias, et cetera, was, well, let me play that part of that real quick here, just so we can all see what I'm talking about here, because this does inform this administration's attitudes towards the press writ large, but specifically the Pentagon press corps. So let me play this sound real quick.
We're here this morning because in hunting for scandals all the time, in trying to find wedges and spin stories, this press corps and the press corps miss historic moments. You miss historic moments like 5% at NATO, which when you hear, I was in the closed door briefing, I wish there could have been cameras in there. When you heard the prime ministers and presidents of other countries, to a man and to a woman, looking at President Trump and saying, this never could have happened, never would have happened. Seemed impossible 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 8 years ago. But here we are because of your leadership. If you ask them the question, I bet they'd say the same thing. But searching for scandals, you miss historic moments, like recruiting at the Pentagon. Historic levels in the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. Yeah, maybe there'll be a little mention here or there, but because it was under President Trump's leadership, because Americans are responding to him as commander-in-chief, the press corps doesn't want to write about it.
Okay, so that was the lead-in, and then he sort of went after his former company mate, Jennifer Griffin, when she tried to ask a pretty basic question.
Highly enriched uranium. Do you have certainty that all the highly enriched uranium was inside the Fordo Mountain, or some of it, because there were satellite photos that showed more than a dozen trucks there 2 days in advance? Are you certain none of that highly enriched uranium was moved?
Of course, we're watching every single aspect, but Jennifer, you've been about the worst, the one who misrepresents the most intentionally. What the president says. I'm familiar.
Report about the ventilation shafts on Saturday night, and in fact, I was the first to describe the B-2 bombers, the refueling, the entire mission with great accuracy. So I take issue with that.
I appreciate you acknowledging that this
issues.
was the most successful mission based on operational security that this department has done since you've been here, and I appreciate that.
So you and I both know Jennifer. Painting her as the worst with respect to getting it wrong is kind of profane, and also a little bit unexpected, since they did both work at Fox. But to that point, let's remind the viewers of the fact that Pete Hegseth was not a journalist. He was a host of the morning show, basically. So he comes at this from a different point of view. In terms of the history of him as Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, of course, the first misstep was the Signal Gate, right? Where he basically, in a Signal thread, Signal being the messaging app, put times on target for a strike against the Houthis. And then the last statement in there is this classic, "We are clean on OPSEC." So that was obviously very embarrassing for him. As I said at the time, as a former carrier-based aviator, if this kind of information is released to the enemy beforehand, that definitely hazards me. So this is not cool at all. In any case, those things have sort of informed the approach towards the media. So this brings up, Brad, where some of the folks that have done op-eds and been quoted point out the difference between being basically, as one journalist said, a stenographer and a reporter. I know from my time as the V-22 Public Affairs Officer, Communications Director, that if I was asked a fair question that I rather this person didn't know about that little problem we had with the airplane, whether it's hydraulic tubes or an engine fire that we had or a high rate of descent near mishap kind of thing, because what would happen is guys like you would come armed with all the facts and then ask me for a comment. That put me in a very uncomfortable spot. And so what I would do is hopefully be armed with it and be able to deconstruct their issue or contextualize it in a way where this is kind of why we have developmental tests. We understand that issue, and as a function of that, now we've changed the descent curve, or our engineers are fixing that engine issue, or this is kind of what happens. This is why you have a systems command. This is why you have test pilots, so forth and so on, right? But I didn't attack the reporter for asking a hard question and a potentially embarrassing question. My point is that the American public wants professionals who aren't beholden to the Department of Defense, War, whatever you choose to call it these days. We want folks who are digging, who have the fiduciary responsibility to get to the truth, and that's how democracy thrives.
Nancy Youssef of The Atlantic, who says, remember, This is what she told PBS. Remember, the Defense Department is an organization that uses nearly $1 trillion of taxpayer money and employs some 3 million people. And so being able to get as much information to the public as possible about what's happening in the building, the decisions that are being made about consequential national security decisions is critical to our reporting. And it allows us to bring the kind of nuance and detail to make for the most accurate reporting on issues as important as when the nation goes to war. Now, I will say, you were mentioning Hegseth and a couple of clips of his from a while back. He describes the agreement that he was asking reporters to sign as common sense and something that will eliminate a risk in national security reporting. But he doesn't present any evidence that it would present a risk. And he also, when he was talking to the reporter in the clip, doesn't present any evidence of why she's the worst. Some things he said about the agreement are just inaccurate. For example, he suggests that reporters don't wear badges, and we've always had to wear badges above the waist, as the agreement says. And he suggested that reporters could go anywhere in the building, which is not accurate either. We can go in most unclassified spaces, and that's all we've been able to do. But let me finish up with something that Tom Bowman wrote for NPR as an op-ed, he said. So Tom writes, "I've held my Pentagon press pass for 28 years. And for most of that time, when I wasn't overseas in combat zones embedding with troops, I walked the halls, talking to and getting to know officers from all over the globe." And I'll just pause here and say, this is kind of what you know, Ward, is that trust makes the world go round. And when you can talk to people and have conversations with them, it helps everybody. It helps, it helps the public understand what's going on. And it helps reporters and military people do their jobs. So he said it's called journalism, finding out what's really going on behind the scenes and not accepting wholesale what any government or administration says. And then Tom goes on to quote an earlier Tom, Thomas Jefferson, and he says, "No fan of the press himself, Jefferson once wrote that our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that, quote, cannot be limited without being lost." And he knew a free and fair press is an essential safeguard to a functioning democracy. And so Tom winds up, so now how will the American people find out what is being done at the Pentagon in their name, with their hard-earned tax dollars, and more importantly, the decisions that may put their sons and daughters in harm's way?
To that point, because I agree entirely with both Nancy and Tom with the statements they made there are things going on with respect to the Department of Defense, Department of War. Again, if I say it's the Department of Defense, half the commenters get pissed, and if I say it's the Department of War, the other half get pissed. So, in any case, we have things going on, whether it's the F-35 program, the F-47 program. We're waiting for the announcement of FAXX, Ford-class carriers. So the program of record is under scrutiny. And again, as you mentioned, the taxpayer dollars are being used in ways that are perhaps inefficient. Further, we have some conduct of war and the law of armed conflict circumstances going on, particularly off the coast of Venezuela, that you need third-party reporting, because when these are violated in any way, who's ultimately hazarded isn't the enemy combatant, it's our forces. And this is why these laws exist. So I don't care where you fall politically, you want a free press. You absolutely want a free press for reasons that perhaps you don't understand. And let me put up this right here that is the misunderstanding of the press that hopefully you deconstructed here, Brad, is what Daisy says here. Is this because they can't roam the Pentagon freely? Do they believe they deserve unrestricted access to highly classified military installation under the First Amendment? And Hegseth says, yes. Okay, that is absolutely not what's at issue here. And the fact that he retweeted that and commented yes is of great concern. The other thing that he's done lately, when organizations like the New York Times and the Washington Post explained why they weren't signing the access policy or acknowledging it, he just put a little bye emoji like, okay, see ya. And that's also kind of not the stance you want your Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War to have. So I will restate here. as my final thought, Brad. What I said before, which is I wish Secretary Hegseth was leaning into his public affairs officers as much as he's leaning into the Pentagon press corps. Because you know what's the easiest job in the military right now? Being a public affairs officer. Because all you have to say is no and hang up the phone. How do I know this? There's a whole bunch of them that are doing little to nothing right now because of this policy, instead of giving the press the accurate information and also running the press down when they get it wrong and trying to correct them in factual ways. That's what your PAOs should be doing. And in so doing, the truth comes out and the American public is well served. So, Brad, you're a very busy guy. Thank you for coming by and giving us some great perspective today.
I appreciate you having me on board, and I love your channel, and keep up the good work.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.